The damned weeds would be the death of him. They resisted the assault of 54-year-old Master Gunnery Sergeant retired Martin Kelvin like no other enemy had in its entire career as a CSF Marine, refusing to be rooted out and constantly returning in the face of fire, chemical weapons, and sheer brute force. I could have done this better when I was 100% flesh and blood, he told himself, though he knew it was a lie. The bionic prosthetics were just as agile as his old leg and arm, and he was probably stronger than he would have been without them. Not stronger than he'd been in his prime, of course, but his prime had been over 20 years ago. How much over he constantly debated with himself, and with Cosmo. Cosmo's opinion was the only other one that mattered to him. Martin wiped the sweat out of his eyes with the eagle, globe, and anchor tattoo on the back of his right arm and cast an accusatory look at Cosmo. "Why the hell am I the only one working here?" Martin grumbled. "Are you just gonna sit there and watch the whole time?" Cosmo replied earnestly, regarding him with the same big brown eyes that had forced Martin to pick him out of all the other pups in the shelter. He was probably purebred German Shepherd, or at least close enough that Martin had never bothered to get him DNA tested. Not that it mattered. Whether Cosmo had genes that took him all the way back to Max von Stefanitz in 1899 or had a few mutts in the closet mattered not to the dog's primary job, keeping one Martin Kelvin sane and barely stable. It would be easy for him to go off the deep end out here in the middle of nowhere, BFE, with no one for company except the trees and open fields and some pretty mountains in the background. Someone had named the planet Eden, which it looked like now, in summer, but which seemed very ironic in the dead of winter when Martin was snowed in for days at a time, stuck in the house with old movies and older memories. The dog had been a condition of his retirement, forced on him by the psychological therapists at the Veterans Administration. He'd fought tooth and nail, right up until the minute he'd seen a 10-week-old Cosmo. How long ago had that been? Around a decade now. Maybe a bit longer, maybe not. Martin could have looked up the exact date on his link, but that would have involved breaking his concentration on the battle with the weeds. It seemed inconsequential compared to his former job defending the colonies, but it was just as important to his survival. He needed the output of the garden to make it through the winter. Not that he'd starve to death, being honest. The local CSF office would loan him the money to buy food, but going into debt would mean he couldn't live off his retirement, and he was bound and determined not to be forced into the ultimate humiliation of getting a real job. No. He was content picking weeds on his little homestead and avoiding the bottle, unlike Frank Cage, his best friend. Former best friend. Forget that shit, pull weeds. Pulling weeds was easy, just physical work. He could turn off his brain and let the memories stream away from him. But thinking about Frank had short-circuited the process, and even the rhythmic motion couldn't put the memories to sleep. He didn't need to look up when the last time he saw Frank was. Almost 5 years to this day when they bumped into each other in town with their dogs. They both lived in Arcadia, and while the capital city of Eden was huge, their paths were bound to cross at some point. It wasn't even noon, and Frank was already well on his way to being shit-faced. They had made eye contact, and instantly the anger in Frank's gaze ignited like a wildfire. "What right did you have, you bald motherfucker?" he had shout slurred. Cosmo and Rex had growled, but not at each other. They had prevented Frank and Martin from getting into a brawl right in the middle of the street. That memory transported Martin back farther, to images of war, screaming faces, frozen in their death masks, horror and fear. The faces of the Marines were bad, but the faces of the civilians, the children, those were the worst. "Damn it," he muttered. Cosmo sensed it, as always, and rubbed against his prosthetic leg, whining for attention. Martin sighed and gave it to him, as always. Cosmo loved to have his ears scratched, and his anxiety at his master's stress evaporated into bliss, his tongue hanging out in a goofy smile that put the lie to his fierce appearance. Martin smiled. He couldn't help it. The memories faded as he concentrated on making the one creature he could always count on happy.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.